On a warm July night in 1992, a young mother tucked her baby into bed, kissed him good night, and stepped onto her porch to make a phone call. By sunrise, she was gone. No sign of struggle. No goodbye. Just gone. Her car sat in the driveway. Her purse, her keys, her shoes, all left behind. And yet, Amy Cross was never seen again. For 30 years, her disappearance has haunted the quiet town of Bellwood, West Virginia. Was she taken? Did she walk away? Or did someone close to her hold the answer all along? This is the story of Amy Cross, and the night that changed everything. If cases like Amy's matter to you, consider subscribing and turning on the bell. The more these stories are heard, the harder they are to ignore, and sometimes keeping them alive is the only path to answers. In the summer of 1992, the quiet town of Bellwood, nestled in the foothills of West Virginia, was a place where people knew each other by name. The kind of town where everyone's business seemed to be everyone else's, yet secrets could still slip through the cracks. On July 26, 22-year-old Amy Cross was celebrating the most ordinary of milestones, a birthday. Her son Eli had just turned 1. It was a day of joy, of cake, of laughter shared between family and close friends. The house in the hills was filled with the smell of frosting, homemade pie, and the kind of warmth that only a family gathering could bring. Amy's mother, Carol, had come from a few counties over, and her younger sister, Lacey, had baked the cake. Eli's father, Sean, though distant and complicated, was there just like he always had been for the moments that mattered most. It was a simple celebration, no grand gestures, just a shared love of family, of time passing, of a son growing older. As the evening waned and guests began to leave, Amy seemed as content as ever. She kissed her son's cheek, tucking him into his crib with a soft lullaby, and exchanged a few quiet words with Lacey before heading out to the front porch to call Sean. The house, nestled at the top of a long, winding dirt road, stood still, a quiet sentinel in the gathering dusk. But something was off. As the clock ticked past midnight, Amy's phone remained silent. Sean was supposed to drop by to pick up some of Eli's toys, a promise he had made before the party began. Amy had placed the final plate in the sink just a few minutes before she went outside to make that call. But Sean never came. The phone didn't ring. The next morning the world would change. Amy was gone. The morning after the party, the scene at the house in Bellwood was eerily calm. The front door hung slightly ajar, as if it had been left in a rush. Her car, an old sedan, sat in the driveway, parked in its usual spot. The windows were rolled down, the air inside thick with the humidity of a summer night. No sign of struggle. No muddy footprints. No obvious disturbance. Inside, everything was in place, just as Amy had left it. Her purse sat on the kitchen table, her wallet still inside, a small photo of Eli tucked into the fold. Her shoes were left by the front door, the soles slightly scuffed from the walk she had taken just the night before. Her personal items, the ones she had taken with her every day for years, were untouched in a way that suggested Amy never planned to leave them behind. But where was she? Lacey was the first to arrive after the police. She had driven up early to check on her sister, concerned that something was wrong. Amy was always so reliable, she would never have just disappeared. The phone call from the sheriff's department had been the beginning of a nightmare that only deepened with time. Lacey stood in the kitchen now, a chill settling over her as she stared at the table. Amy's things, her wallet, her keys were still there. How had this happened? No one had seen anything, no one had heard anything unusual. The only sound that had punctuated the night was the hum of the crickets outside, a lullaby that only seemed to add to the disorienting stillness. The crickets outside, a lullaby that only seemed to add to the disorienting stillness. The sheriff's deputy who arrived to investigate took a few notes, made a few calls, and tried to piece together what might have happened. But nothing fit. Amy had been the life of the party the night before. She had been smiling, laughing, and making sure everything was perfect for Eli's first birthday. She had left the party in the middle of a normal evening, making the rounds to say goodbye before stepping out to make a simple phone call. She had spoken with no one that would suggest she planned to leave, not a word that would lead anyone to believe anything was wrong. But she was gone. As the sun rose, so too did the unanswered questions. The case quickly became a mystery, one that held its grip on the town for years to come. Why had Amy vanished? Why on such a significant day? Theories swirled, but nothing was concrete. Some in town said she might have left voluntarily, that she had been seeking an escape from the pressures of motherhood. Others wondered if someone close to her had played a role in her disappearance, perhaps an argument gone too far, or a hidden secret Amy had been harboring. Lacey, though, never believed that. She knew her sister too well. Amy had loved Eli. She had loved her family. She would never have walked away without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Amy. Her name appeared in the local news, her face on missing persons flyers, and her story was shared across the state. The quiet streets of Bellwood, normally so predictable and safe, were now rife with fear and suspicion. Had someone seen her? Had she been taken? Was she still alive? And if she was, where could she possibly be? But the leads dried up just as quickly as they had appeared. The investigation stalled. Deputies and later detectives worked tirelessly, combing through every inch of the town, interviewing anyone who might have known something, anything that could bring them closer to the truth. The search for answers only seemed to grow more frustrating. The case went cold, and time passed. In the years that followed, people in Bellwood whispered about Amy, about her disappearance, but nothing substantial was ever found. As the years wore on, rumors and theories took root. Some wondered if Amy had left town to start a new life, leaving her past behind and disappearing under an assumed name. Others thought she had been the victim of foul play. Perhaps someone she knew had done something to her, something dark and unimaginable. Yet there was no concrete evidence to confirm any of these theories. And then, in 2022, after decades of searching and waiting for a breakthrough, the town was forced to face the painful reality. Amy Cross was legally declared dead. The case, once full of promise, was now officially closed. But for Lacey, that declaration wasn't the end. It was just another chapter in the story of a woman who had disappeared without a trace. She refused to let her sister's memory fade into the fog of time. For years, Lacey kept pushing for awareness, advocating for further investigation, speaking to reporters, working with organizations dedicated to missing persons, trying to keep Amy's name alive, hoping someone, somewhere, might hold the key to her disappearance. Every year on Eli's birthday, Lacey would light a candle in Amy's memory. The small ceremony was just for the two of them, a moment of reflection and grief, a ritual of remembrance that never felt like enough. And yet, no answers ever came. The town of Bellwood moved on as towns often do. People drove by the old house, the one where Amy had lived, and some remembered her with fondness, others with curiosity, wondering what had really happened. But deep down, no one truly forgot. One question remained unanswered. Where did Amy go? It had been nearly a week since Amy Cross vanished. Bellwood's sheriff, Tommy Hayes, sat at his desk, his elbows resting on the scattered papers that had become the story of Amy's disappearance. A grainy printout of the missing persons report, along with a few blurry security camera stills, cluttered the workspace. The sound of the phone ringing was like the ticking of a clock, reminding him of the pressure mounting from all sides. Local news was breathing down his neck. Her family was frantic, each day growing more desperate, and the townspeople had begun to whisper. But no one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Not a single lead had come in that was more than the ramblings of a concerned neighbor or a passing stranger who thought they'd spotted her car at a gas station 10 miles outside of town. It was frustrating, suffocating even, as Hayes sifted through the old school files, wondering how something like this could just slip through the cracks. Amy hadn't been a stranger in Bellwood. Her life had been as predictable as the changing of seasons. She had a small circle of close friends. She had never disappeared without a trace before. So why now? Why on Eli's first birthday? Hayes leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. It was then that he had a thought that sent a chill through his bones. What if someone in her life, someone who knew her well, was involved? By the end of the second week, the investigation had shifted. Sheriff Hayes and his deputy, Sarah Adams, had begun digging deeper into Amy's personal life, focusing on the small details, the ones that might seem insignificant at first glance but could hold the answers they desperately needed. They spoke to Lacey, Amy's younger sister, who had seemed like the obvious person to turn to for answers. She was shaken, yes, but she was also steadfast. She had no real answers to offer, just memories of their childhood, of the bonds between them, and of Amy's love for Eli. Sean, Eli's father, was the next person to be scrutinized. It was no secret that their relationship had been strained. The separation had been a quiet one, almost amicable on the surface, but everyone who knew the two of them could feel the tension beneath it. Had that tension finally boiled over? Had something triggered Amy's sudden disappearance? Or was it something more sinister? The sheriff and Deputy Adams visited Sean at his home, a rundown trailer just outside of Bellwood. Sean was sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling between his fingers, his face weary and drawn. It was still early, but the fog of grief hung heavy in the air. "Sheriff," Sean greeted them with a tight smile, his voice thick with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "What's the news? Has anyone found anything?" "Not yet," Hayes replied, his tone measured. "But we're looking at all possibilities. We have to ask, did you see Amy the night she disappeared?" Sean shook his head, flicking his cigarette away. "She left after the party. We didn't speak much afterward. I don't know why she'd leave like this. It doesn't make sense. I don't know if she's just trying to get away or if something happened, but I don't know. I don't know anything." Sheriff Hayes studied Sean, trying to gauge if he was telling the truth. His alibi was solid, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of Hayes' mind, one that couldn't be easily ignored. Something didn't add up. Sean's reaction was too rehearsed, too controlled for someone who was genuinely worried about the mother of his child. "Have you heard anything unusual in the past few days?" Deputy Adams asked, cutting through the tension in the air. "Anyone mention seeing Amy? Did she leave you any messages, anything at all?" Sean ran his hands through his hair, looking out at the overgrown yard. "No, nothing. She wasn't one for messages. She just disappeared and I'm just trying to make sense of it." Sheriff Hayes could tell that Sean was hiding something. But what? As the investigation continued, Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Adams began to piece together a pattern. They discovered something that had eluded them before. Amy had been more active in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there were signs that Amy had been preparing for something. Something she hadn't mentioned to anyone. They found it in her phone records. A series of calls to a number that was not saved in her contacts, calls that had started just a few weeks before her disappearance. The numbers were traced to a pay-as-you-go phone, and despite their best efforts they couldn't locate the caller. The mystery deepened. Who had Amy been speaking to in secret? And then there were the whispers. At the local diner, where Amy had been a regular, the waitress remembered a man who had been frequenting the place in the weeks before Amy's disappearance. He was a drifter, she said. A loner. He would come in, order coffee, and sit for hours flipping through newspapers. But what caught the waitress's attention was the way he would linger near the missing persons section. There was something strange about his obsession with the articles. He would tear out pages, fold them up carefully, and keep them hidden in his jacket. The man was never able to be identified, at least not yet. But he was another piece in the puzzle. The search for Amy took on a new urgency as Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Adams continued their investigation. They began to look into the area surrounding Amy's home, especially the dense woods nearby. Could Amy have wandered off into the wilderness? Was there something in those woods that might give them a clue? With the help of search volunteers, they combed through the forest, following every lead and searching for anything that could point them in the right direction. They found footprints, scattered bits of clothing, and even a piece of jewelry that might have belonged to Amy. But none of it brought them any closer to finding her. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The town of Bellwood, once a quiet and peaceful place, became a hotbed of gossip and suspicion. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what happened to Amy, but no one had any real answers. The sheriff's office began to investigate the possibility of foul play. A few locals had come forward with stories, claiming that they had seen Amy in the days leading up to her disappearance, walking near the outskirts of town with someone. The problem was, no one could agree on who that person was. It could have been an old friend, or perhaps someone she had recently met. Theories were all they had now. Amy's disappearance remained one of the town's greatest mysteries, a cold case that refused to die. Sheriff Hayes, despite his frustration, couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. That small detail, that one key piece, remained elusive. As he sat in his office late one evening, staring at the case file, he wondered if they would ever find the answers they so desperately needed. Would they ever find Amy? Or was she lost forever in the fog of a town that had been forced to move on? Weeks had passed since Amy Cross's disappearance, and with each day that passed, Bellwood's anxiety deepened. The once silent streets, where gossip was as common as the morning fog, now buzzed with an undercurrent of unease. The townspeople had long since stopped asking, "What happened?" and had begun whispering, "Who did it?" The very air seemed saturated with suspicion, fear, and a growing desperation for answers. Sheriff Hayes had watched the case spiral in every direction: foul play, voluntary disappearance, random accident. It was the uncertainty that gnawed at him, that slow, suffocating crawl of not knowing. But as much as he and his team searched, every lead led to another dead end. It was then, on the 5th week of the investigation, that something new emerged. A call came through the sheriff's office. A voice on the other end was shaky, hesitant. "I think I saw her," the woman said. The call came from Gail Matthews, an elderly woman who lived in a modest home at the edge of Bellwood, just a few miles from Amy's. She was a local who kept mostly to herself, with a reputation for being a bit of a recluse. I don't know if it means anything," she stammered, "but I think I saw Amy walking by the road near Hollow Creek Bridge, the day after she disappeared." Sheriff Hayes froze. It was the first real lead they'd gotten in weeks. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, Deputy Adams close behind. At the bridge, the atmosphere felt heavy with the weight of years of unanswered questions. The creek, slow and relentless, meandered beneath the rusted guardrails. The water moved with a quiet determination, hiding the secrets beneath its surface. Gail Matthews had said that Amy was walking near the bridge, her steps slow, as if lost in thought. But the day after her disappearance? It didn't add up. The sheriff's gut twisted. They interviewed Gail in her modest kitchen, the smell of baking bread hanging in the air as she nervously sipped her tea. "I didn't think much of it at the time," she explained. "You know, sometimes you see people when you don't really expect to. I was sitting by the window when I saw her walking down the road just past the creek. I thought it was odd, but she looked fine just like she always did. And you're sure it was her? Deputy Adams asked. Gail nodded, though she seemed less certain now. It was her. But she didn't look, I don't know, she didn't look like herself. Like she wasn't in a hurry. Almost like she was waiting for someone. Did she see you? Hayes asked, leaning forward. No, Gail said, her voice barely above a whisper. She just kept walking like she didn't notice the house or anything. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't think it was important. The sheriff's office ran the lead. The surveillance footage from the nearby gas station showed nothing definitive. No sign of Amy, no car, nothing that would corroborate Gail's story. But something about it nagged at Hayes. People didn't just vanish, not like this. He started to wonder if someone had known exactly where Amy would be. The search teams began to focus on the area around Hollow Creek Bridge. The creek, with its deep currents, its tangled mess of overgrown foliage, seemed like the kind of place that could swallow someone whole and never let them resurface. The bridge had been there for decades, but there were rumors that some parts of it weren't entirely stable, especially after heavy rainfalls. Sheriff Hayes couldn't shake the thought that it might hold the answer they'd been searching for. The rumors had started early on, whispering of secrets, of things that no one had wanted to acknowledge. One rumor was the idea that Amy had been hiding something, maybe even running from someone. People spoke of a man, a stranger, someone who had been around town in the weeks leading up to Amy's disappearance. Some said he had been in the diner, others claimed he had been at the gas station, asking questions about Amy. Sheriff Hayes had heard it all before. People filling in the blanks with speculation and half-truths, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Then there was James "Jimmy" Miller, a name that had been tossed around since day one. Jimmy was a local who had grown up with Amy, and while he had been a quiet figure in town, his presence was always felt. His reputation was a curious one. He was known for being reliable, a solid worker who had always kept to himself. But in the wake of Amy's disappearance, whispers about Jimmy began to spread. Some said he had a history of getting involved with troubled women. Others said that he'd been close to Amy, too close. Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Adams had tried to avoid jumping to conclusions, but the rumors were too persistent to ignore. They tracked down Jimmy, who lived in a rundown cabin on the outskirts of Bellwood, and asked him about his connection to Amy. At first he was cooperative, too cooperative. But the longer they spoke, the more he seemed to close off. The sheriff felt it, his eyes shifting, his words a little too guarded. "Yeah, I knew Amy," Jimmy said, his voice low. "We were friends. Went to school together. She was good people. I never thought she'd just leave like that. What can you tell us about her in the days before she went missing?" Deputy Adams asked, watching his face closely. Jimmy hesitated. "I don't know. We talked a few times. Nothing out of the ordinary. She was having some trouble with her relationship, I think. But who isn't? Did you see her the night she disappeared?" Hayes pressed. "No," Jimmy replied quickly, too quickly. "I was at home that night. Just watching TV." The sheriff studied him, wondering if there was something he wasn't saying. Was Jimmy hiding something? Or was he just another part of the puzzle, a piece that didn't fit quite yet? The investigation had reached a turning point. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to shift, and Sheriff Hayes was beginning to feel that they were closer than ever to an answer. But every lead that seemed promising faded just as quickly. The key to finding Amy was there, buried in the small details, in the connections that had been overlooked. The question was, who would be the one to put it all together? The town of Bellwood had started to change. The shadows had lengthened, and the air was thick with tension. People spoke in hushed tones. They avoided the creek, avoided the bridge. No one wanted to think too much about what might lie beneath the surface, about the truth that might never be uncovered. But the sheriff knew one thing for sure: time was running out. It was mid-September when the sheriff's office received a crucial lead, one that threatened to break the case wide open. The call came from a local pawn shop that had, for reasons unclear, kept a record of a small transaction made by someone who had recently shown interest in purchasing jewelry from their display case. The man was described as scruffy, disheveled, wearing a thick coat despite the lingering summer warmth. The pawn shop owner, an older man named Hank Dawson, didn't think much of the interaction at first. But something about the description of the man stuck in his mind. That nagging thought, one that had come and gone, suddenly felt more urgent. He hadn't been able to identify the man in the store at the time, but the pawn shop records showed the date, July 27th, the day after Amy vanished. The man had left the store with a piece of jewelry, one that could be tied to Amy. Sheriff Hayes reviewed the details. The transaction was small, just a simple gold bracelet with a charm shaped like a crescent moon. But it was unique. Hayes had seen it before. It was the bracelet Amy had worn every day since her teens. The sheriff's office moved quickly. They began to track down the pawned item's transaction history, pulling security footage from the shop's cameras. The grainy footage revealed a man, unmistakably wearing a cap, eyes shadowed under the brim, who had approached the counter in a hurry. He seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact as he placed the bracelet on the counter, offering a quick, almost dismissive transaction. Hayes' stomach churned. The man was familiar. It was Jimmy Miller. By the time they tracked Jimmy down, his cabin had become a place of constant scrutiny. Every time Sheriff Hayes drove past, he felt his skin crawl. Something about it, its isolation, its stillness, felt like a waiting room for answers, and Jimmy Miller was the man who held the key. Jimmy was at his cabin when Hayes and Deputy Adams arrived. He hadn't expected them to come by today, but the moment he saw them step out of the squad car, the realization hit him like a wave. He knew what they had found. His eyes darted toward the small window, a thin veil of guilt washing over his face. "You got a lot of questions, Sheriff," Jimmy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You sure you want to hear the answers?" Hayes stepped closer, watching him carefully. "You know why we're here." Jimmy gave a short, bitter laugh, then leaned against the doorframe looking resigned. "You think I had something to do with Amy? Is that it?" "I think you've got a lot to explain, Jimmy," Hayes replied. "We know you pawned Amy's bracelet the day after she disappeared." "Why?" Jimmy flinched. For the first time since this investigation began, he looked shaken. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, his eyes shifting toward the ground. I just needed the money, okay? I wasn't thinking straight." "Where did you get it?" Deputy Adams asked, her tone sharp. "Why didn't you report finding it?" Jimmy seemed to hesitate, as though weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. "She gave it to me," he admitted. "Amy gave it to me a while ago. She told me she was getting tired of it, that it reminded her of things she didn't want to remember. I didn't ask any questions. I just took it." Sheriff Hayes exchanged a glance with Deputy Adams. They had heard rumors of a close friendship between Jimmy and Amy, one that bordered on more than platonic, but hearing it from Jimmy's mouth hit differently. There had always been something about their relationship that felt uneasy, but now they had confirmation of something more intimate. Something Amy had tried to distance herself from. "So you took it and then you just kept it?" Hayes pressed. "You didn't think to tell anyone she'd given it to you?" Jimmy looked away. "I didn't want anyone to think anything was going on. There wasn't. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Sheriff. I never wanted her to leave." "Where was she the night she disappeared, Jimmy?" Hayes asked, the suspicion in his voice rising. Was she with you? No. Jimmy snapped, his voice rising with a defensive edge. No, she wasn't with me. I swear. But you saw her after she disappeared? Deputy Adams pressed, her tone cold. You knew she wasn't coming back, didn't you? Jimmy stepped back, his breath catching. You've got it all wrong, he said, but Hayes could see the cracks in his facade. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know where she went. She didn't even tell me. Despite his protests, Jimmy Miller became the primary focus of the investigation. The more they looked into his background, the more secrets they uncovered. His relationships with women were troubling at best, and his history of getting involved with troubled individuals only painted a darker picture of his connection to Amy. They found out that Jimmy had been known to offer a way out to women who were struggling, offering them a chance to start over, to disappear from their current lives. The idea that Amy might have fallen into this pattern seemed more plausible as the details of his life emerged. But was it that simple? Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Adams dug deeper into the timeline. Jimmy's alibi for the night of Amy's disappearance remained flimsy at best. He had claimed to have been at his cabin alone watching TV, but there was no one to verify his story. The more they pressed, the more his story wavered. Then, an unexpected discovery came in the form of a phone call. A witness, a truck driver passing through town on July 27th, reported seeing a man matching Jimmy's description walking down the road near the outskirts of Bellwood. The truck driver swore that he had seen Jimmy near the Hollow Creek Bridge, just hours after Amy's disappearance. Sheriff Hayes was back at square one. Theories crumbled beneath him like wet paper, but there was something undeniable about the path they were now on. Jimmy Miller had always been there, lurking in the shadows of Amy's life, and the closer they looked, the clearer it became that his role in her disappearance couldn't be ignored. But what was his motive? Was it love? Obsession? Or something darker still? Winter had come to Bellwood, bringing with it the usual shroud of mist and biting cold that clung to the streets, making everything feel even quieter than usual. The case, once full of promise, had now reached the point where every lead seemed to end in confusion. The story of Amy Cross, her disappearance, and the questions surrounding it had become a stain on the town that no one could scrub away. But even after the years of searching, of asking the same questions over and over, there were still no answers. Sheriff Hayes sat in his office, staring at the cold case files scattered across his desk. The weight of it all pressed down on him. Despite all the evidence, despite all the digging, the one thing that still eluded him was the truth. What had really happened to Amy? Was Jimmy Miller the answer? Or had he been just another pawn in a game much larger than anyone could comprehend? He glanced at the old, faded photograph on his desk, the one of Amy holding her son Eli, smiling under the bright summer sun. It seemed so out of place now, like a relic from a different world, a time before everything had spiraled out of control. A time before all the questions, the secrets, and the lies. But that was the truth, they all had secrets. And Amy, it seemed, had carried hers until the very end. The investigation had reached its final stretch. Jimmy Miller had finally been cornered. His alibi crumbled under the pressure, and the truth had begun to seep out, slow and steady. They had uncovered enough evidence to make an arrest, but there was still something off about it all. Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something bigger, a piece of the puzzle that still hadn't clicked into place. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning in late December, something broke. It wasn't the confession they had been hoping for. No, it was much darker. A set of documents had surfaced, papers that hadn't been seen before. They weren't even from the sheriff's office. They came from an anonymous tip, a letter slipped under Hayes's door with a few simple words. It's not over. Look at the crossing. The note was cryptic, vague, but the words "the crossing" stood out. It was a location, one that had been part of the investigation from the very beginning, the Hollow Creek Bridge. But what did it mean? Why was the letter delivered now, after all this time? Sheriff Hayes spent hours poring over the documents, finding a set of coordinates scribbled on the back of one of them. Coordinates that pointed directly to the edge of the creek, just a few hundred yards from the bridge. The location had never been checked before, and for the first time in months, Hayes felt a glimmer of hope. Was this the breakthrough they needed? The sheriff's office mobilized quickly, assembling a team to search the area. The frigid air bit at their skin as they trekked through the woods, the dead leaves crunching underfoot. The path was narrow, the trees thick with the weight of winter. They reached the coordinates, and for a moment, it seemed like nothing was there. But then, under the blanket of snow, something gleamed, a piece of metal half buried in the dirt. It was a key. The moment it was uncovered, a knot twisted in Hayes's stomach. He recognized the key instantly. It was an old brass key, the kind that didn't belong to a modern lock, a key that could have easily fit into the lock of an old chest or drawer. But why had it been buried here near the creek? And why had it never been discovered until now? Hours later, after combing through the area further, a small chest was discovered hidden beneath the underbrush, covered in moss and dirt. The chest was rusted, its edges sharp and weathered from years of exposure to the elements. Sheriff Hayes felt the weight of it as he pried it open, his heart racing with the anticipation of what it might contain. Inside there were only a few items: old photographs, a small notebook, and a letter. But it wasn't just any letter, it was a letter from Amy herself. The letter, dated just days before her disappearance, was addressed to someone in the town. It was short, but the contents were clear. "I'm leaving. I can't keep living like this. I need to get away from everything, from everyone. Please don't try to find me. I don't want to be a burden on anyone anymore." The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Amy's. But what did it mean? Had she left voluntarily? Had she planned to disappear all along? Was it possible that she had simply decided to vanish, to escape from a life that had become too complicated, too suffocating? The discovery of the chest sent shockwaves through the investigation. Had Amy truly left on her own terms? Had she wanted to disappear so badly that she had hidden everything away, ready to start a new life somewhere else? The questions piled up, one on top of the other, but the answers were just out of reach. Sheriff Hayes and Deputy Adams returned to the town, to the people who had known Amy, to her friends, her family, and the ones who had cared for her. The investigation was no longer about finding someone to blame, it was about understanding the truth. Amy had been a woman who had loved her son, who had been a sister, a daughter, a friend. She had been a person with desires and fears just like everyone else. And somewhere along the way something had changed. But what had really happened to her? Was she running from her past, or had something else driven her to disappear? And if she had been running, had anyone helped her? Or was she on her own, lost in the woods, trying to find peace? Sheriff Hayes stood by the creek that had now become a symbol of the mystery, staring out at the water as it flowed slowly past. There were no more answers here. No more clues. Only the silence. The town of Bellwood, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a place of uncertainty, where even the most ordinary things, like the crossing of a bridge or the sound of the creek, could hold a darker meaning. The people of Bellwood would go on with their lives, but they would never forget Amy. They would never forget the woman who vanished, and the questions she left behind. The porch light at her old house would flicker on and off, just as it always had, but no one would come home to turn it off. Not anymore. The case remained open, but the answers were elusive. Did Amy choose to disappear on her own, or was there something more sinister at play? The discovery of the letter and the key seemed to suggest that Amy had left willingly, but the truth was never clear. Had she been running from someone? Or was it simply a matter of wanting a new start, free from the weight of expectations? If Amy's story hit home for you, go ahead and subscribe for more true crime stories. And tell me, do you think she left on her own, or does someone out there still know the truth? I'd love to hear your take in the comments.